So in this video we're going to talk a little bit about choosing a camera and features to look for in a camera and some things like that. We're going to go over the controls you're going to look for, talk about camera size and whether you want interchangeable lenses or not, image quality and some of the factors in that, talk about raw shooting, resolution, sensor size, zoom range, image stabilization, and then video, which is getting more and more prevalent in still cameras, and LCD size, and maybe some other things. So there's a couple of resources you might check out. I mentioned these, I think, in some other videos, but one is dpreview.com. They have a camera feature search that you can see here. You can pick different kinds of sizes of cameras and different features and sort of filter them out and then sort of find the kind of camera that fits your needs. You can see it has kind of a scale too of kind of the different kinds or formats of cameras. You have ultra compacts, which are very small, compacts, which are small but not as small, SLR like, which are kind of like some of the higher end point and shoots, and then large sensor compacts, which are the very highest end sort of small cameras. Then you have sort of SLRs, and rangefinder means it doesn't have, you're not looking through the actual lens, you're looking through another viewfinder. But anything that says SLR, these four here, means single lens reflex, which basically usually means, almost always, that you are looking through the lens. You can see in this image here, you're looking through the lens when you are looking through the viewfinder. So there's a mirror inside the camera that's bouncing the image up to the viewfinder so you could see it. Unless you're shooting in live mode, which means you're kind of using the LCD instead. But that's what SLR means, is there's a single lens, there's not another viewfinder besides the lens. A lot of these smaller cameras will have a separate viewfinder that you're looking through, but not all. Some of them don't now. They just have the LCD only. So DP Review, again, is a great site to check out for camera reviews, comprehensive reviews, image samples, that kind of stuff. And we'll look at one of those in a minute to talk about some of the features you might look for. If you're going to buy a camera, I usually recommend bhphotovideo.com, which is a New York-based store that has pretty much everything electronics. But they kind of got their start, I think, doing photography supplies. So they have pretty much everything you could ever think of. The prices are pretty good, usually better than you'll find locally. There's no tax if you're buying it from here, assuming you don't declare your tax at the end of the year. And they won't try to upsell you. There's a lot of photo magazines or photo magazines that have ads for photo supply houses or stores, superstores sort of, that they are a little bit, let's say, shady, where you will call them or order something and they'll try to switch you to something else, or they'll say you need this and you need that if you buy this camera, which you actually maybe don't need. These guys won't do that, so they're reputable. A lot of people use them for everything. So that's B&H, and they also have, you see, they have this in-depth learn before you buy section where you can kind of do research. And here's the photography section right here. So if you're going to buy something, you could check that, and they have reviews and things. And obviously, you could look at Amazon and look at cameras. And there's lots of reviews in there, so you'll see pretty good prices there, and you'll see reviews, and you can read the reviews and see if people like them or not. And yeah, so those are some resources that you can use. There are some others. Steve's Digicams, I think I've listed some on the website. You can check those out as well, but they're kind of similar. So I'm going to go back to this review of the Canon PowerShot G12, which is a camera right now anyway from Canon that's reviewed on the dpreview.com site. And I'm just going to use this to go through some of these features that I mentioned that have a lot of technical terms in them, so kind of explain them a little bit. And I kind of put these in order, a rough order, as far as what I think is kind of the most important things to look for in a camera. at least for our purposes for this class. So the first thing is manual controls. It says shutter priority and aperture priority. What does that mean? Well, we're going to talk about shutter speed and aperture and things like that in other videos. But for now, just think that shutter priority is the length of the exposure, how long the picture how long movement is occurring, or how long the exposure is for the picture to be taken. It's usually expressed in fractions of a second. So you could say a half second, a 500th of a second, 2/50th of a second. They're all fractions of a second or longer than a second. And what that means is that is how long the lens is letting light through to the light-sensitive chip in the camera. So that's shutter speed. It's how long the image takes to photograph. Aperture, which is the other part of this, here's shutter priority, aperture priority. Aperture is how much or how big the hole is that you're letting the light through. So one is how long you let the light through. The other is how big the hole is, or that you're letting light through. So those are two controls that are very important for creative photography because they allow you to control a lot of things. You can freeze action. You can manipulate depth of field. You can blur things. Depth of field we're going to talk about as well later. But those are two very important controls that you might have. So if I'm going to look down through this review here, and you'll see somewhere it has exposure modes. Here we go, modes. So you see it says auto, program, AE. Those are pretty similar. Here's shutter priority and aperture priority. So you're not going to find these on a lot of let me blow this up a little bit. You're not going to find these on a lot of lower end cameras or cheap cameras. The reason is point and shoot is kind of like that term that's used. You're supposed to point it and shoot it. You're not supposed to have to think about it. So, but to really be creative in the control of your images, you kind of need those controls. Sort of another version of that is manual. Manual means you're setting the shutter speed and the aperture. And we will again talk about this later. So shutter speed and aperture are two of the three parts of what some people call the exposure triangle. The other one is the ISO, or the sensitivity of the light sensitive chip. In manual mode, you set both. You set the aperture and the shutter speed. Shutter priority means you set the shutter speed and the camera sets the aperture. And aperture priority means you set the aperture and the camera sets the shutter. All three go together to make the correct exposure. Exposure is just another way to say how much light got to the sensor. So those are two very important things. Another thing is camera size. So camera size seems like, well, who cares about camera size? But you can see that there's quite a big range of camera sizes. So why would you want to have an ultra compact or compact? Well, they're portable. They're easier to carry around. Why would you want to have an SLR? They take better images in general, probably. The downside of an SLR is they're big and heavy. So a lot of times you might not have it with you when you want to take a picture because you didn't want to carry around this big camera. The downside of a compact is they usually don't take as good of pictures or have as much control as the SLRs. So camera size is kind of a big thing. If we look at these two cameras here, you'll see that we have this little point and shoot, which is easy to carry around. This one happens to have some manual controls and things, but because it's so small, there's not a lot of room for physical buttons. So you have to go into menus to do things. So if I turn this on here, if I wanted to change the exposure mode, I have to click on a button and then click on this button and then do the wheel and do some different things, which we'll get into later. But it's a little more involved than, say, if I do it on this camera. So this is an SLR, digital SLR. You can see there's buttons all over it, which we'll talk about in another video. But I can get to a lot of things that I need to do through a menu right with a button on this camera because there's more room, basically. I can change tons of things with never going into a menu. Rarely do you even need to go into a menu, actually. You can control most things through the buttons and wheels on the camera. So that's one advantage of a bigger camera is you have more space. Another advantage is they weigh a little bit more, so they don't shake quite as much because they have more inertia. So those are a couple of the benefits of each size of camera. Another thing you obviously want to think about is image quality. So better cameras take better images, right? Wow, that's hard to figure out. One of the main things that will affect that is lens quality. So how do you know about lens quality? One good indicator of the quality of a lens is its maximum aperture. So if we look back at our example image camera here, the G12. Let's see, let's find the lens here. Here's the lens. So this number is one of the important ones here. This says f equals 6.1 to 30.5 millimeters. What does that mean? Oh no, actually I'm looking at the wrong number. That's the focal length. This is the number that I was looking for. This is the f-stop. So it says 2.8 to 4.5. What does that mean? Generally, for now, we're going to do we'll see another video later about aperture. But generally, for now, what you need to know is the lower this number, the better. So that is an indicator of the quality of the lens. It's a very good indicator of it. If you look when you're buying lenses, if you go to B&H Photo, you look at two lenses that are pretty much the same as far as focal length, how much they magnify, what kind of camera they're for, that kind of thing. The one with the lower f-stop number here, which means a bigger maximum aperture, is going to be more money. It's going to be more expensive. But the reason it's going to be more expensive and cost more money is it takes better images and it lets in more light. It allows you to shoot in low light situations, for example. Why are there two numbers here? So a lot of lenses will have a different maximum aperture, or the hole again that the light's going through, depending on if you're zoomed in or not. So this one says 2.8-4.5. That probably means that when you're zoomed out, which is called wide angle, you're going to get f2.8 with this camera. And if you're zoomed in, meaning your telephoto, you're kind of making everything bigger, looking farther away, you're going to get an f4.5. So the lower this number, the better in general. The next thing is raw shooting over here in our list. So raw means you're going to shoot a proprietary type image for that usually manufacturer. Each manufacturer usually has their own proprietary format. So I'm going to look around for image types. Let's see here. I was way up at the top here. File formats here. So it says still, JPEG, which is the most common type of image file type you're going to get on a digital camera. Then this is RAW. So that means this camera shoots RAW files. A couple of benefits to RAW is you usually get more dynamic range, which is a fancy term that just means the ratio of lights to darks. So it sees more brightnesses. You can think of it that way. And it allows you to do a lot of editing after the fact that would damage a JPEG file. And we're going to get into that a lot more. It's a giant subject. You can also see that it's listing the movie format here too. So a lot of these cameras, maybe almost all of them now, the smaller cameras anyway, and even the bigger cameras, will shoot some type of video file. So that's another thing that we'll talk about in a minute. The next thing is resolution. So that is right here. These are image sizes, which is another way to say resolution. So that just means how big is the image that the camera can take by pixel dimensions. So this camera can shoot up to 3,648 by 2736. That means 3,648 pixels one way and 2736 the other way, which is a pretty big image. There might be some, yeah, that's the biggest one it looks like. So that is a resolution. You might hear a camera talk about, or a feature called, megapixels. How many megapixels is the camera? Megapixels just means millions of pixels. So if you multiply this by this, you'll get the megapixels. It's just the largest sized image that camera can output. For a long time, there was sort of a megapixel race. Who could make the biggest resolution camera? But now it's almost not important anymore. You really don't need much more than, most of the time, more than 6 or 8 megapixels for any, especially if you're going to put the image on the web. You don't need a giant image, even unless you're doing something specialized, like you're doing an ad or a poster that's going to go on a bus or something. Then you would need a lot of pixels. But for most intents and purposes, almost all cameras now are going to have enough resolution for anything that you're going to do with them. Unless you're going to blow up, again, make a 6-foot image or something, then you might need more pixels. But generally, you don't need that awful many. Although another advantage to shooting more pixels is you can crop. So that's resolution. So don't worry too much about, oh, this one's 8 and this one's 10. That's not a big deal. It's not a big difference. So as long as it's, any modern camera is going to have enough resolution for most things. Sensor size. So what does sensor size mean? Sensor is the light-sensitive chip that's in the back of the camera. Generally, the bigger the sensor size, the better in general. Just mostly because the bigger the sensor is, the more light it can gather and the better it sees, especially in the dark. So you might hear terms like full frame. A full frame camera is one that has a sensor the same size as a 35 millimeter camera used to have film. So a 35 millimeter film camera had a piece of film that went through it, and each one was about 35 millimeters by 24 approximately, which is pretty big. Most cameras do not have that big of an image sensor now, digital cameras. But if it's full frame, it does. Why do you care? Well, again, the bigger sensor, the better as far as gathering light. Another reason is because of crop factor. So crop factor means when you use a lens especially on an SLR, so here's our SLRs again. When you use a lens on an SLR that was made for a film camera, or any kind of camera almost, it is going to crop a little bit of that image away. So basically what it does is it magnifies the image a little bit. Sometimes that's good if you want to get closer to something. Sometimes it's not as good because your lens doesn't work like it did on a film camera. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but that's one of the effects of what the sensor size is crop factor. Another thing you might look at is zoom range. So zoom range is how much the camera can zoom and basically magnify things. So that's what this is right here, what I was looking at before above the maximum f-stop. So you see this 28 to 140 millimeters. That's the zoom range. That tells you this camera has a pretty decent wide angle. You can see kind of a lot of the scene to a pretty decent telephoto, which means I can zoom into something farther away. And we're going to do a whole probably video about that, so I'll talk about that more later. But that's something you would look at. Some nice cameras don't have much of a zoom range, so you'll find that, wow, I can't get close enough. I have to walk up to things, or it's not good for sports because I'm too far away, that kind of thing. So another thing you might look at is image stabilization. Image stabilization is a way that the camera can compensate for vibrations that you make. So you're trying to handhold and shoot a picture, and your hand is moving and there's not a lot of light, so the exposure is longer. And then what's the camera going to do? So cameras can, a lot of cameras now can try to fix that for you. And there's different ways you can do that, and we'll probably talk about that a little more later. Video is, like I said, is now very big, especially in still cameras. All the way to a lot of, or I wouldn't say a lot, but yeah, a lot of commercial video, and even TV and feature film work is sometimes now done using still cameras. For instance, I think the Canon 5D is used some on Hawaii 5.0 and House, 2 TV series to shoot parts of episodes. And those are still cameras that you can buy. They're expensive, but they're 1/100th of the cameras that they usually use to shoot this kind of high definition video that's going to go on broadcast TV. So video is kind of a big deal. It's a little difficult to combine to make a camera that does both really well, but they're getting much better. And you'll see video samples along with still samples on DP Review because of that. So you'll see that video is becoming a big part of it. Dedicated video cameras are still around, but a lot of things you can do now on your camera, on your still camera. What you might look at as along those lines is, do you have video out? Meaning, can you get video out of the camera to your TV, for example, using an HDMI cable. So if that's important to you, you might look at that. And then the last thing I have here, and there's a million other features that we could talk about, but the last thing I have as far as things you might think about is LCD size. So different cameras will have bigger LCDs or smaller LCDs. A bigger LCD has the advantage of you can see your image better on the camera. The downside of a bigger LCD is that it uses more energy usually, so it could make your battery run out faster. So that's the downside. But anyway, that's just a quick overview of some features that you might look for. And like I said, there's tons of other features you could think about. If you look at any camera specifications, you'll see a giant bullet lists of other specifications. But these are the important ones. For our purposes, it would be great if you had a camera that had manual controls, shutter priority, aperture priority, manual. Oh, I kind of skipped over interchangeable lenses a little bit. Let me backtrack a little bit. So if we look at our two cameras here again, obviously this one does not have an interchangeable lens. It has one lens. You sometimes can get little add-ons that go on the front of these compact cameras to make them more telephoto, that kind of thing. But generally you're stuck with one lens. The good part about that is you can't lose it. You don't ever open the camera, so you're not going to get dirt in your camera. The advantage on an SLR, one of the advantages is these lenses come off. So if I press this button and turn it, you see the lens comes off. Now I'm looking inside the camera. I don't want to leave it off very long because one of the bad things about that is you can now get dirt inside the camera. Your camera is open if this lens is off, so you have to be careful. The upside is I can change lenses depending on the situation. So if I'm shooting sports, I may put a giant lens on here, a giant telephoto lens, so that I can see farther away from where I am. If I'm shooting something close up, I might use a shorter lens that has a wider angle of view, which we'll talk about. But that's the advantage of an SLR type camera with interchangeable lenses. There is another format that's kind of getting popular as of now, which is called Micro Four Thirds, which is sort of in between these kinds of cameras and SLRs. So you might check those out. They're just now getting to be a little bit popular, but the gist of it is they're smaller than SLRs, so they're easier to handle physically a little bit, but they do have interchangeable lenses, so it's kind of trying to be the best of both, but we'll see where that goes. Okay, so that's our little camera styles and features intro.